The year was 1886, and in the high country of the Wyoming Territory, the season of reckoning was coming. Autumn was a frantic, desperate accounting, a final tallying of assets, split wood, cured meat, mended wool, against the coming liabilities of wind and snow and the merciless, grinding cold. For Elias Thorne, it was his first accounting alone. His wife, Martha, who had been the chief architect of their dream in this raw land, now lay on the gentle slope behind the half-finished cabin, under a small mound of stones and a simple wooden cross. He was left with her dream, their 8-year-old son Samuel, and a problem of unforgiving physics. How to keep the life-giving warmth of a fire from fleeing into an atmosphere that wanted nothing more than to steal it. And his solution, to the few other souls scattered across the valley, was evidence that the grief had finally broken his mind. He was building his cabin against a fallen giant, an Engelmann spruce that had been a monarch when the United States was still a notion. It lay along the northern edge of his small clearing, a colossal corpse 6 feet thick at its base, its bark a craggy map of its long life and slow death. This trunk was to be his north wall. Amos Kelleher was the first to come and stand in judgment, a man whose face was cured leather and whose opinions were as hard and unyielding as the granite bedrock of the mountains. Amos had been in this territory for 20 years. He understood its rules. He approached Elias not with malice, but with the grim certainty of a man watching another sign his own death warrant. He stood with his hands on his hips, his gaze tracing the unnatural line where Elias's carefully notched pine logs met the sweeping, uneven curve of the great spruce. "Thorne," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to carry the weight of 2 decades of winters. "What in God's name are you doing?" Elias did not stop his work, sighting down the length of a log he was preparing to hoist. "I'm building my house, Amos." Amos spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near his own boot. "You're building your tomb. That log is a wick. It'll draw every drop of damp from the ground and feed it right into your walls. You'll have mildew and rot before the first thaw, if the cold doesn't take you first." Elias paused, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He looked at the great log, not as a symbol of decay, but as one of permanence. "The heartwood is sound, Amos. It's been lying here, curing on this south-facing slope, for longer than you've been in this valley. There's no rot in it." Amos Kelleher let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "Curing? Elias, it's dead. Dead wood touching the earth wants only one thing, to become earth again. It'll bring termites, carpenter ants, every burrowing thing that lives. And you're laying your hearthstone not 10 feet from it. You're inviting fire to consume you or damp to poison you. A man builds in a clearing. He builds with 4 walls of his own making, and he trusts a stone fireplace, not a dead tree." His wife, Dora, who had come with him, stood a ways back, her expression a mask of pity. She saw a man unmoored by loss, clinging to a mad idea like a drowning man to a splintered plank. Her judgment was softer than her husband's, but, in its way, more damning. It was not a critique of his method, but of his sanity. Later, Constance Hartwell came by. A widow herself for 5 years, she had weathered the pity and the unsolicited advice of men like Amos. She knew that survival sometimes demanded a different kind of thinking, a logic born of desperation and observation rather than tradition. She brought Elias a small sack of dried apples and a jar of chokecherry jelly, and she watched him work for a long while in silence. She saw the precision of his cuts, the patient way he scribed the end of each log to fit the contour of the massive trunk. This was not the work of a frantic, grief-stricken mind. This was the slow, deliberate labor of a man possessed by a deep and abiding conviction. She did not ask what he was doing. She asked how he was doing it. "It must be difficult," she said, her eyes on the complex joinery, "to make a straight thing meet a curved one so cleanly." Elias gave her a rare, brief smile. "It is," he admitted. "It takes more time to measure than to cut." She nodded, understanding the wisdom in that. She was the only one who did not treat his project as a folly. She saw the immense effort, the painstaking care, and reserved her judgment, choosing to watch and wait. Her quiet curiosity was a greater gift than the apples. The community's skepticism was a constant low hum in the background of his labor, but Elias paid it little mind. Their wisdom was built on a foundation of what was done, a catechism of passed-down practices that worked well enough not to be questioned. They saw a dead log and thought of rot and fire. Elias saw something else entirely. His understanding was not rooted in the traditions of the frontier, but in a different education altogether. He had been a bookkeeper in Boston, a man of ledgers and sums, but his father had been a shipwright in a Maine boatyard. Elias had spent his boyhood breathing the scent of pine tar and sawdust, watching his father and the other men transform timber into vessels that could withstand the fury of the Atlantic. They were masters of wood, and his father spoke of it as if it were a living thing with moods and a memory. He had taught Elias that the heartwood of an old-growth tree, dense with resin and compressed by centuries of slow growth, was almost a different material from the soft, porous wood of a young tree. It was heavy, durable, and resistant to water and decay. It was the ship's soul. But it was not his father's teaching alone that had sparked this idea. It was his own quiet observation, a habit of mind from his years spent hunched over columns of figures, searching for patterns. In his first year in Wyoming, living with Martha in their miserable, drafty lean-to, he had noticed a peculiar phenomenon. On a clear day, after a cold night, the large granite boulders scattered in the meadows would be covered in frost. But as the sun climbed, even the weak sun of late autumn, it would burn the frost from their dark surfaces. He had once sat and eaten his lunch against such a rock in the late afternoon, and was surprised to feel a distinct, if faint, warmth radiating from it long after the sun had dipped below the western peaks. The rock had drunk the sunlight and was now slowly breathing it back out into the cooling air. He saw the same effect on a smaller scale with fallen logs whose bark had weathered to a dark, almost black color. They held the day's heat. Watching an outcome, he knew, was not the same as understanding the principle. The men in the valley saw the warm rock and thought nothing of it. Elias saw the principle: thermal mass. His great fallen spruce possessed an immense thermal mass. It lay perfectly positioned, its dark, sprawling trunk facing due south, exposed to the sun's rays for the entire short winter day. He calculated it in his head, the bookkeeper's mind taking over. The sheer volume of the wood, its density, its dark, absorbent surface. It was a battery designed to store heat. A conventional cabin with a roaring fireplace was a study in inefficiency. The fire heated the air, which immediately rose and escaped through the chimney and the countless cracks in the walls, pulling in cold drafts to replace it. The moment the fire died, the cold pounced. His cabin would be different. The small iron potbelly stove he intended to install would provide the immediate, direct heat for cooking and comfort. But the log, his silent northern partner, would do the heavy work. It would absorb the sun's energy all day, and its internal temperature would slowly rise. At the same time, the stove's radiant heat would also warm its inner face. Then, through the long, 17-hour winter night, as the outside temperature plummeted to 30 or 40 below zero, the log would begin its slow, steady release of that stored energy, radiating a gentle, persistent warmth into the small, well-insulated space. It would act as a massive thermal flywheel, smoothing the brutal peaks and valleys of temperature, keeping the cabin not hot, but temperate, livable. He had tried to explain this to Amos Kelleher once, in the simplest terms he could muster. "The sun will warm it all day, Amos," he'd said, gesturing to the great trunk. "Like a rock in a field, it will hold that warmth and let it go through the night." Amos had stared at him as if he'd suggested they could fly by flapping their arms. "It's a log, Elias," he had said, drawing the word out as if explaining to a child. "A log. Wood burns. Wood rots. A rock is a rock. You can't change the nature of a thing by wishing it. You're a bookkeeper, not a carpenter. You should stick to what you know." Elias had simply nodded and returned to his work. He knew then that the principle was invisible to them. They could only see the material, and their experience told them that a wall of wood was a poor insulator and a dangerous neighbor to a fire. They could not conceive of the wood as both wall and engine, as both shelter and hearth. He would not be able to convince them with words. The proof would have to be lived. It would have to be felt. The work was slow and consumed him completely. First, he and his hired ox, Bartholomew, had dragged the smaller logs he had felled and peeled over the summer. He had dug the foundation for his 3 man-made walls deep, sinking the base logs 2 feet into the earth to draw on its stable, subterranean temperature. Then began the most arduous task, fitting the cabin to the tree. He did not fight the log's shape, he yielded to it. For every log that would form the east and west walls, he had to scribe its end to match the trunk's uneven surface. He would lay a log in place, then use a compass of his own making, 2 sharp nails driven through a piece of wood, to trace the giant's contours onto the end of his building log. 1 nail rode against the spruce's bark, the other scratched a precise, identical line onto the log he was about to cut. Then came the patient work with the adze and saw, chipping and cutting away the excess wood until the log nested against the trunk, as if it had grown there. Samuel, his son, would watch, his face a mixture of awe and confusion. He would run his small hand over the finished joints, marveling at the seamless fit. He filled the gaps between the logs not with the sloppy mud daubing he saw on other cabins, but with a careful 3-part chinking. First, he packed dried moss deep into the crevices, then a thick layer of mud mixed with grass for tensile strength, and finally, a smoother finish of clay he had found by the creek bed. The 3 walls he built himself were tight and solid. The north wall was the trunk itself. The roof was his final act of insulation. He laid down a heavy timber frame, covered it with a layer of aspen bark, and then piled on 6 inches of thick, heavy sod, cut from the meadow in dense squares. The grass was still green on top. By next summer, it would be a living roof, covered in wildflowers. For now, it was a heavy, earthen blanket. He cut 1 window opening in the south wall, where the sun would enter, and a single door in the east wall. Inside, the space was small, no more than 16 by 20 feet. The great curved wall of the spruce dominated the room, its weathered bark a textured landscape that felt ancient and alive. He built a stone hearth for his small potbelly stove, carefully placing it so that a sheet of salvaged iron he'd scavenged could shield the log from the stove's most intense direct heat, while still allowing the radiant warmth to reach the wood. By the first week of November, it was done. The first snows had already dusted the high peaks, and the air had a crystalline edge that promised a deep and lasting cold. He moved their few possessions inside: 2 bunks against the east wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 stools, Martha's rocking chair, and the precious iron stove. The day he first lit a fire, the cabin filled with the scent of pine and curing wood smoke. He and Samuel ate their supper of rabbit stew and hard biscuits at the table, the small stove glowing a cheerful red. Outside, the wind began to rise, a low moan that would soon become a shriek. Elias felt a profound sense of peace. He had done the work. He had followed the principle. Now, all that was left was the test. He looked at the great wall of wood, its surface catching the flickering firelight, and felt not fear, but a quiet, hopeful partnership. He had wagered his and his son's survival not on tradition, but on an idea. And the Wyoming winter was coming to collect. The blizzard arrived not with a sudden fury, but with a slow, deliberate strangling of the world. It began with a sky the color of slate, a gray so heavy it seemed to press down on the very land. The wind fell away into an unnerving silence. Then, the first flakes began to drift down, fat and lazy, as if with no particular purpose. Within an hour, the air was a churning chaos of white, and the wind had returned with a vengeance, a high, keening howl that scoured the landscape. Elias stood at his single window for a time, watching the world dissolve. The Kelleher place, a half-mile down the valley, vanished. The trees at the edge of the clearing became faint ghosts, then disappeared entirely. The world shrank to the four walls of his cabin, and the sound of the storm was a physical presence, a constant pressing roar that vibrated through the very logs. He secured the heavy wooden bar across the door, checked the chinking for any sign of a draft, and then turned his back on the storm. Inside, a strange and potent quiet reigned. The thick sod roof and the earthen-banked walls muffled the storm's roar to a distant, ignorable rumble. The true test, however, was not the sound, but the cold. This was the crucible. For 3 days they were sealed in. The snow piled up against the window, plunging the cabin into a dim, perpetual twilight, lit only by the flickering glow of the stove and a single tallow lamp. This was the period of faith. There was nothing to be done, no way to gauge the success or failure of his design except to exist within it. He had to trust the process he had set in motion, to have faith in the slow, invisible exchange of energy that was the heart of his idea. He fed the small stove sparingly, adding a split log every few hours. Amos Kelleher would have a firebox crammed with wood, a roaring inferno that consumed fuel at a terrifying rate. Elias's fire was a small, contained thing, a model of efficiency. He was not trying to fight the entire Wyoming winter with a single stove. He was merely trying to maintain a small bubble of warmth, trusting his silent partner to guard the perimeter. He showed Samuel how the stove worked, how the damper controlled the flow of air and the rate of burn. "A big fire is a hungry fire," he explained, his voice calm and steady against the faint howl of the wind outside. "It eats your wood and sends most of the heat right up the pipe. A small fire, a steady fire, warms the iron, and the iron warms the room." The boy watched, his eyes wide. He was not afraid. The cabin felt safe, secure. He would press his ear against the great log wall and report with a grin, "I can't hear the wind in this one, Papa." Elias would nod. "That's because it's too thick. The wind can't get a grip on it." He tended his system with the methodical patience of a man who understood every component. He cooked their meals on the stovetop, the smell of bacon or simmering beans filling the small space. He read to Samuel from the one book they owned, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. They were shipwrecked, too, on a small island of warmth in a sea of frozen fury. But unlike Crusoe, Elias had designed his fortress with a secret ally. On the second night of the storm, the temperature outside plunged. Elias knew the signs, the way the logs of the cabin contracted with sharp, cracking sounds like pistol shots. the fine crystalline powder of frost that began to form around the edges of the doorframe, despite his careful seals. This was the deep cold, the killing cold, the cold that found its way through the smallest crack and leached the life from a man. The fire in the stove required more attention, but still, he kept it small and controlled. The air in the cabin grew cooler, the warmth contracting into a smaller circle around the stove. Samuel slept soundly in his bunk, wrapped in a wool blanket and a buffalo hide. Elias, however, stayed awake, watching, listening, feeling. He was not anxious. He was vigilant, an observer at the climax of an experiment. He sat in Martha's rocking chair, the faint glow from the stove's grate casting long shadows on the curved wooden wall behind him. The moment of truth was approaching. Sometime after midnight, he let the fire burn down to a bed of glowing orange coals. This was the ultimate test. In any other cabin in the valley, this would be the point of surrender, when the cold would pour in like a flood, and the inhabitants would huddle under every blanket they owned, shivering and praying for dawn. The temperature in the room began to drop noticeably. Elias felt the chill on his cheeks and the back of his neck. He sat perfectly still, letting the moment stretch. He could hear the faint, rhythmic breathing of his son. He could hear the muffled, endless scream of the wind. He waited. The chill did not deepen. It held steady. After 10 minutes, he stood up and walked away from the dying stove. The air was cool, certainly, but it was not the sharp, biting, invasive cold he had expected. It was a passive coolness, not an aggressive one. He walked to the north wall, the great silent trunk of the Engelmann spruce. He hesitated for only a second, then placed his bare right palm flat against the rough bark. The proof was immediate and undeniable. It was warm. It was not the heat of a stove, not a surface heat that scorched and faded. It was a deep, resonant, and profound warmth, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the ancient tree. It was the stored energy of the sun from 3 days prior, a ghost of daylight that had been captured and held in the dense cells of the wood, and was now being released in a slow, steady, radiant wave. He could feel the gentle power of it flowing into his hand, a warmth that felt less like a product of physics and more like a living pulse. He pressed his cheek against the wood, the rough bark imprinting on his skin. He smelled the faint, clean scent of dry pine and ancient resin. This was the sensory climax, the moment where theory became tangible reality. The principle had held. The log was not a dead wall. It was a living hearth, a silent engine turning sunlight into sanctuary. In that moment of quiet triumph, he felt a sudden, sharp connection to his father. He remembered the old man running a calloused hand over the keel of a new schooner, saying, "This wood has memory, Elias. It remembers the sun and the wind that shaped it. You build it right, and it'll carry that strength across any ocean." His father had been talking about structural integrity, but Elias now understood it on a different level. This wood remembered the sun, and that memory was now keeping him and his son alive. He felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost brought him to his knees. Gratitude for his father's wisdom, for his own stubborn curiosity, for the great fallen giant that had given its body to be their shield. It was a victory, not over Amos Kelleher or the Doubting Valley, but over the brutal, impersonal laws of thermodynamics. He had not broken the rules. He had simply used a different one, a slower, more patient rule that the frantic, heat-hemorrhaging world of his neighbors had forgotten. He had built his house right. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. The wind died, and a blinding, silent, white world was revealed. The snow was drifted to the eaves of the cabin. It took Elias an hour of hard work with his shovel to tunnel out from the door. As he was clearing a path, he saw a figure struggling toward him through the deep drifts. It was Amos Kelleher, his face rimmed with frost, his breath coming in white plumes. He carried a heavy rifle and had a look of grim determination. He had come, Elias knew, on a rescue mission. He was expecting to find a father and son frozen or on the verge of it, their fuel exhausted, their foolishness paid for in full. Amos reached the cleared patch of ground in front of the cabin and leaned on his rifle, breathing hard. "Thorn," he gasped. "You and the boy, you all right?" Elias nodded. "We're fine, Amos. Come inside." He held the door open. As Amos stepped across the threshold, he stopped dead, his mouth falling slightly open. A wave of stable, temperate air washed over him, a stark and shocking contrast to the brutal 30 below zero cold he had just been fighting through. The air inside wasn't hot or stuffy. It was simply comfortable. He saw Samuel sitting at the table, calmly carving a piece of wood. The boy wasn't bundled in layers of wool. He wore a simple shirt. The stove was glowing, but it was a low, gentle fire, not the raging inferno Amos had been imagining. His eyes, wide with disbelief, scanned the small room, searching for the trick, the explanation. "Your stove," he finally managed, his voice raspy. "You must have burned through half your woodpile." Elias shook his head. "Not even a quarter of what I've got stacked. It wasn't the stove that did the work. It was the wall." Amos stared at him, then his gaze moved to the immense, curved wall of dark spruce. He walked toward it slowly, as if approaching a sleeping animal he was not sure he wanted to wake. He looked at the seamless joints, the solid, immovable presence of it. He had seen it before as a monument to folly. Now he was seeing it as something else, but he did not yet know what. He looked back at Elias, a question in his eyes. Elias simply nodded toward the log. Hesitantly, Amos reached out a gloved hand, then thought better of it. He pulled the thick leather glove from his right hand, his fingers red and stiff with cold. He placed his bare, calloused palm flat against the wood. His expression changed instantly. The hard mask of skepticism dissolved, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He felt the impossible warmth, the deep, steady, radiant heat. He pulled his hand back as if burned, stared at his own palm, and then pressed it back against the log, confirming the sensation. He turned to look at Elias, his eyes full of a dawning, profound understanding. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he uttered the words of surrender, the plain-spoken admission that was the only apology he knew how to give. Well, I'll be damned. That admission was the turning point. Amos Kelleher, the Valley's foremost pragmatist and skeptic, had been converted not by theory, but by undeniable physical proof. He asked Elias to explain it again, and this time, he listened with an entirely new quality of attention. He didn't understand the words, thermal mass, radiant heat, solar gain, but he understood the feeling of warmth on his frozen hand. He understood the sight of a healthy child and a small woodpile after a 3-day blizzard. He stayed for an hour, drinking hot coffee and soaking in the gentle, persistent warmth of the cabin. When he left, he was no longer a critic. He was a herald. He told the story to everyone, and his word carried the weight of unquestioned experience. The tale of the Thorn cabin and its warm wall spread through the sparse community, transforming from a story of a grieving man's madness to a legend of improbable ingenuity. That spring, when a new family named Hartley began to build their homestead farther down the canyon, they did not seek a flat clearing. Instead, they came to Elias Thorn. Hiram Hartley, a man as practical as Amos, asked Elias to walk his land with him. Elias pointed not to a fallen tree, but to a south-facing granite cliff face, a sheer wall of dark rock that baked in the sun. "Build against that," Elias told him. "Bank your walls with earth. Put your window on the south. Let the mountain be your hearth." Hartley listened, and he built his house according to the principle, adapting it to his own landscape. The knowledge began to transfer, to evolve. People started to look at their surroundings not just as a backdrop, but as a potential partner in their survival. They began to understand that the most powerful forces, the sun, the earth, the very mass of the world, could be allies, if you only knew how to ask. Elias Thorne lived in that cabin for another 34 years. Samuel grew to manhood within its warm, solid walls, learning its secrets, learning to see the world not just for what it was, but for how it worked. The cabin became a landmark, a testament to a different kind of wisdom. Travelers caught in early storms would seek it out, knowing they would find a safe and warm harbor. The story of its creation became a piece of local lore, told around fires on cold winter nights. It was the story of the quiet bookkeeper from the East who, in his grief, saw what no one else could: that a fallen giant, a dead tree, could hold the memory of the sun in its heartwood. It served as a lasting lesson that tradition is merely the record of what has worked before. But true, enduring innovation comes from understanding the principles that made it work in the first place, and then having the courage to build your house against them.